It was the year 1944. Europe was in ruins, cities scarred by fire and rubble, skies torn open by bombers, and lives shattered in a war that seemed endless. On the battlefields, men clashed in steel and blood, but far away from the front lines, a very different story was unfolding. A story that would forever remain etched in the memories of those who lived it. For many Germans, capture by the Allies was a nightmare beyond imagination. Propaganda had told them they would be starved, tortured, or forgotten in the shadows of prison walls. But for the women who found themselves prisoners of war in American camps, reality struck them like a lightning bolt, because what awaited them was not the cruelty they feared, but an unexpected world of comfort, order, and humanity. Imagine stepping from the chaos of a collapsing Reich into a place where you were handed fresh food, warm clothes, and treated with a dignity you thought had vanished forever. To these women, who had marched through ruins, who had lived under air raids, who had known hunger and terror, the clean bunks, steaming meals, and even small gestures of kindness seemed almost unreal. These were the German female POWs, and their disbelief was not quiet. They whispered it among themselves, wide-eyed and hesitant, and years later, they would still tell the tale, that in America's camps, they discovered a strange, almost dreamlike comfort in the very heart of captivity. When the German women were first transported to American camps, the journey itself felt like the end of the world. They were packed into trucks, silent, their eyes hollow, their hands gripping small bundles of belongings they had managed to keep. Every bump on the dirt road rattled their bones, and every turn of the engine brought them closer to what they imagined would be misery beyond imagination. Rumors had swirled among them for weeks, that American soldiers treated prisoners with contempt, that they worked them until they collapsed, that they left them starving in cold barracks with no warmth, no humanity, no hope. For many, those rumors were as real as the hunger in their stomachs or the war they had just left behind. They prepared themselves for the worst. The trucks eventually slowed and stopped. A strange stillness fell over them, broken only by the sound of boots crunching on gravel. The women hesitated, their eyes darting toward one another, waiting for the moment when cruelty would descend. But when the back doors creaked open, what met their eyes was not the terrifying image painted by propaganda, but something utterly unexpected. Instead of a wasteland of barbed wire and dirt, the American POW camp stretched before them with a sense of order and structure. The first thing they noticed was the neatness. The compound was lined with wooden barracks, long rows of buildings that looked more like dormitories than prisons. The walls were freshly painted, not collapsing or covered in soot. The air smelled faintly of pine, clean and sharp, nothing like the choking smoke of bombed-out cities they had left behind. A gravel path wound between the rows, swept clear of debris. Everything seemed intentional, controlled, designed not to punish but to function. The women paused, stunned into silence, their bodies frozen on the truck steps, as if afraid to believe what they were seeing. They were ordered to disembark, but the guards did not shout. They gestured calmly, their rifles carried but not pointed. The women shuffled forward, their shoes scraping against gravel, their eyes constantly scanning the camp. They braced themselves for cages or dark, damp cells, but instead found themselves standing before barracks with doors already open, the interiors visible from outside. Inside were rows of wooden bunks, each one lined with mattresses and clean sheets. Sheets. Some of the women nearly gasped out loud at the sight, because in Germany even beds had become luxuries. Bombings had reduced many to sleeping on bare floors, huddled in cellars, listening to the distant thunder of war. And here in captivity, they saw blankets folded neatly at the ends of beds, pillows resting softly against headboards. For a moment, they could only stare. It was as if their senses were betraying them. They had braced for chains and cages, yet what stretched before them was structured and orderly, even peaceful. A few of the younger women exchanged furtive glances, almost ashamed at the relief that coursed through them. Relief was dangerous. It meant allowing themselves to hope, and hope could be crushed. But as they were guided into the barracks, their fear began to unravel, thread by thread. Inside, the air smelled of wood and soap, faint but unmistakable. The bunks were aligned in perfect order, the kind of discipline one expected from a military camp, but here it was not frightening. It was strangely reassuring. Each woman was shown to a bed, not thrown or forced, but directed. They placed their bundles down on clean blankets, still hesitant, still wondering if this was some kind of cruel illusion. But the sheets were real. The mattresses gave under their weight when they pressed down with tentative fingers. Some whispered prayers under their breath. Others simply sank onto the bunks, their bodies surrendering to exhaustion, as though the simple gift of a bed was too much to bear after years of deprivation. They looked around and saw more. Personal space. Each bunk was spaced with enough room for movement. No crowding, no suffocating closeness that had plagued them in air raid shelters or refugee trains. Even in captivity, there was respect for the idea that each person needed a place to call their own, however small. It was the first taste of dignity they had felt in years. Outside, the camp was quiet. Guards walked their routes with methodical precision, but they did not leer or threaten. The women could see barbed wire fencing in the distance, reminders that they were still captives. Yet even that wire seemed oddly clean and orderly, not the jagged, rusted menace they had imagined. The entire camp carried an aura of restraint, as though its purpose was not cruelty, but control. It was an inversion of everything they had expected. As the evening approached, sunlight slanted through the barrack windows, catching the dust in golden streams. The women sat on their bunks in silence, listening to the muffled sounds of the camp, boots on gravel, distant voices, the faint clatter of utensils from the mess hall. Some were too stunned to speak. Others whispered quietly, their voices hushed as though afraid they might be overheard. "Is this truly captivity?" one asked. Another answered with a shake of her head, her eyes wide with disbelief. The question lingered in the air, unanswered. For women who had spent years surrounded by ruins, seeing the barracks felt almost like stepping into another world. The war had stripped them of comfort, dignity, and safety, leaving them hollowed by fear. Yet here, in a place they had dreaded, those very things were being handed back to them piece by piece. It was not freedom, but it was not torment either. It was survival wrapped in an unexpected grace. Their disbelief was not quiet. It showed in the way their eyes lingered on folded blankets, in the way their hands caressed the rough wood of the bunks as though testing reality, in the way they sank onto their beds with weary resignation and astonishment. They were prisoners, yes, but the barracks that housed them told a different story, one of order, of humanity, of a life that for the first time in years felt stable. The shock of arrival at the American camps would stay with them forever. Years later, when these women recounted their stories, it was not only the food or the routines they remembered first, it was that moment of stepping into the barracks, seeing clean sheets and neat rows, and realizing that captivity did not always mean cruelty. For many, that first night of sleep, safe and undisturbed, was the most restful they had known since before the war began. Food was the first true revelation. For German women, the war had turned every meal into a struggle. Back in their homeland, ration cards determined life and hunger dictated each day. By 1944, bread was dry and scarce, meat was a memory, and potatoes, the staple of their survival, were few and far between. The women remembered standing in endless queues, clutching ration slips with trembling fingers, only to be told there was nothing left. Many had gone to bed with their stomachs twisting in pain, listening to the cries of children whose hunger could not be soothed. They had grown accustomed to scarcity, to cutting portions in half, to boiling weeds when food vanished completely. Hunger had become an unshakable shadow, so when they first lined up in the American camps, fear still clung to them. They expected thin gruel, perhaps stale bread, maybe even deliberate starvation. Rumors had painted horrific images, that Americans let prisoners waste away, that food was denied as punishment. As they stood in line, the smell that wafted toward them seemed like a trick of the imagination. It was warm, rich, and mouth-watering, the unmistakable scent of cooking vegetables, fresh bread, and even meat. The women sniffed the air with disbelief, their noses lifting instinctively, their empty stomachs tightening in anticipation and confusion. When trays were finally handed to them, their eyes widened. On the dull metal plates rested steaming bowls of soup, thick with carrots and potatoes, rich broth curling upward in a fragrant mist. Beside it sat slices of bread, still soft at the center, not the hard crusts of ration scraps. On some days there was meat, an unthinkable luxury. To women who had learned to survive on little more than watery turnip stew back home, this was not just food. It was abundance. Some stared so long at the trays they forgot to move until a guard gently motioned them forward. They sat at long wooden tables, clutching utensils as though afraid the meal would vanish. The first spoonfuls brought silence. Then slowly the tension cracked and the women began to eat, cautiously at first, then ravenously. Soup disappeared quickly, bread torn in trembling hands and devoured with a ferocity that only the starving know. For many, tears blurred their vision as they swallowed mouthfuls of food that tasted almost too good to be real. They whispered to each other, voices trembling, that they had not eaten like this in years. The taste of warm broth was not just nourishment. It was a reminder of life before hunger, before ruins, before the collapse of everything they had known. Day after day, the meals came. They were never extravagant, but they were steady, reliable, and filling. To women who had lived through years of uncertainty, the routine of 3 meals a day felt almost miraculous. They began to trust the rhythm. Breakfast with bread, porridge or eggs, midday meals with soup or stew, dinner with potatoes, vegetables, sometimes a piece of meat or fish. It was not the food of kings, but it was food enough to ease hunger, restore strength, and bring color back to cheeks that had grown pale and hollow. The war outside raged on, but inside the camp, meals became islands of safety, moments when fear fell silent and the body remembered what it meant to be cared for. The act of eating together carried its own weight. Women who had once scavenged for scraps now sat in rows, the steam of food rising into the air like a collective prayer. Some whispered blessings before eating. Others sat in stunned quiet, but all shared the same expression. Astonishment mixed with relief. Hunger no longer gnawed at them each hour of the day. For the first time in so long, their stomachs were full, and fullness brought back something they thought had been lost forever. Dignity. It was not lost on them that the very people they had been told were enemies, the Americans who now guarded them, were the same ones placing food on their trays. The contrast between what they had been led to expect and what they experienced was almost too great to comprehend. Many admitted later that it unsettled them, that it made them question not only the propaganda they had been fed, but the very nature of the war. Why would an enemy feed them so generously? Why would captors ensure they ate better than their own people back home? These questions simmered in their minds, unsettled but unavoidable. Some of the younger women grew shyly bold. They exchanged words with the American cooks or guards, tentative phrases of broken English. The Americans, for their part, often responded with small smiles, a nod, sometimes even a light-hearted remark. Food, strangely enough, became a bridge. It reminded the women that even across enemy lines, even in the heart of captivity, shared humanity could still emerge in the simplest acts, like handing someone a piece of bread. There were moments of guilt, too. Some women, when they thought of their families back home, felt a pang of sorrow as they ate. They imagined their mothers or children scraping together scraps in bombed-out kitchens, while they themselves ate soup rich with vegetables and bread, baked fresh each day. More than one prisoner pushed her plate away with tears in her eyes, murmuring that it was unfair, that she should not be eating better than those she had left behind. Yet hunger always pulled them back, and they ate because survival demanded it, even if guilt lingered. In time, the food did more than just fill their bellies. It healed. Cheeks regained color, bodies grew stronger, energy returned. Some women who had looked skeletal upon arrival began to resemble themselves again. Their hands, once trembling from weakness, grew steady. The simple routine of eating became the foundation of stability. Each meal was a reassurance that life, though fractured, continued. And in a war where so much had been stripped from them, that reassurance was priceless. Years later, many German women would recall not the barracks or the fences first, but the meals. They would tell their children or grandchildren about the hot soup, the bread soft in their hands, the shock of tasting meat after years of deprivation. They would say, with quiet wonder, that captivity fed them better than freedom had in those final desperate years of the Reich. It was a truth so strange that it never left them, a paradox that defined their memory of American camps. Food, in those days, was more than nourishment. It was survival. It was dignity. It was humanity, offered by the hands of those they once feared. And for the German female POWs, that was perhaps the greatest revelation of all. Beyond food and shelter came something even more unexpected: human dignity. For the German women, dignity was something the war had stripped away long before they stepped into captivity. In their homeland, air raids had forced them into basements, trembling in darkness while the world above them burned. They had seen neighbors reduced to rubble, families torn apart, and soldiers barking orders in the streets. To be German in those last desperate years of the war was to be a survivor of hunger, loss, and fear. By the time they were captured, many expected the worst: humiliation, cruelty, degradation at the hands of their captors. They braced themselves for shouted commands, for harsh treatment, for the kind of brutality they had been told to expect from their enemies. Yet when they entered the American camps, what greeted them was something they could not reconcile with the images burned into their minds. The guards who patrolled the camp carried rifles, yes, but their eyes were steady, not cruel. Their voices were firm, but not mocking. They did not shove or strike the women as they entered. They gave instructions in a controlled tone, as though the goal was not to terrify, but to maintain order. For the German women, this restraint was shocking. Many of them whispered to one another that it had to be an act, that the Americans would reveal their true cruelty eventually. But the days passed, and the expected brutality never came. The memory of their first encounters with guards stayed vivid in their minds. When told to line up, the women hesitated, expecting to be screamed at. Instead, they were guided with gestures, their movements watched carefully but without malice. When asked to step into the barracks, the guards did not bark threats. They simply motioned toward the open doors. One woman later recalled how she had braced herself to be slapped for walking too slowly, only to realize that the soldier beside her was merely waiting patiently. It was such a small thing, but to her, it felt monumental. For women who had lived through years of propaganda telling them that Americans were monsters, the contrast was too stark to ignore. Propaganda had painted a picture of brutality, but here, in the calm of the camp, they found themselves addressed not as animals, but as human beings. It was disarming. Some even admitted that it unsettled them more than cruelty would have. Cruelty, they understood. But kindness, however measured, left them confused. Dignity was restored in the smallest of ways. Guards used clear words instead of insults. They allowed the women to walk with their heads up, rather than forcing them to bow or crawl. They gave them time to settle into routines without endless intimidation. When disputes broke out among the women themselves, the Americans intervened with authority, but not with violence. This balance of firmness and restraint created an atmosphere that, while still restrictive, did not crush their sense of self. It was captivity, but it was not dehumanization. The women carried the weight of memories of what the German army itself had done to prisoners of war elsewhere. Many knew, even if only in whispers, of camps where cruelty was the rule, where prisoners were treated as less than human. Some could not help but compare. How strange, they thought, that they themselves, now prisoners, were being treated with more dignity than so many victims of their own regime had been. The realization was uncomfortable, but undeniable. Some nights they lay awake on their bunks, listening to the quiet patrols outside, wondering at the paradox. They were enemies. They were the defeated. Yet their guards did not sneer at them, did not relish their suffering. Instead, they seemed to view their duty with a professionalism that both unsettled and reassured the women. This quiet respect, this recognition of their humanity, began to reshape their understanding of the world beyond Germany's borders. There were moments when the strangeness of it all hit them with full force. A guard would open a door for them to pass. Another would pause to let them gather their belongings without rushing them. These were gestures so ordinary that in another time they would have gone unnoticed. But in the context of war and captivity, they shone with startling significance. Each act reminded the women that though they were prisoners, they were still women, still human, still deserving of the smallest courtesies. For those who had feared being reduced to nothing more than numbers behind barbed wire, this restoration of dignity was transformative. It allowed them to breathe, to feel less like shadows of themselves. They no longer flinched at every approach. Their shoulders, once tense with constant expectation of violence, began to relax. Some even found themselves meeting the eyes of the guards, an act they would never have dared in the first days. The sense of safety that dignity provided was perhaps the most profound of all. Fear did not vanish, but it ebbed. The women could walk across the camp without the constant dread that cruelty waited around every corner. They could follow orders without humiliation pressed into each step. They could exist, not just as prisoners, but as human beings recognized, however reluctantly, by their captors. Years later, many of these women would describe not only the food or the shelter, but the shock of dignity itself. They would tell of how it was not grand gestures that stayed with them, but the simple fact of being treated with restraint and humanity. In their memories, this became the turning point. The moment when captivity began to feel less like punishment and more like survival, with unexpected compassion woven into its fabric. For German female POWs, the dignity given to them in American camps was more than a comfort. It was a revelation. It challenged what they believed about their enemies, about themselves, and about what war could mean. It left them with a memory so sharp it never dulled, the memory of being seen as human in a time when humanity had been so easily discarded. Daily life in the camps held its own rhythm, one that slowly but surely reshaped the lives of the German women who lived behind the wire. When they first arrived, they expected chaos, cruelty, or a kind of timeless limbo where days blurred endlessly together in suffering. Instead, what they discovered was structure, a carefully designed system that gave each day a pattern, a purpose, and a strange, unexpected stability. For women who had known only the unpredictable terror of bombings, the gnawing uncertainty of hunger, and the constant upheaval of war, the rhythm of captivity was paradoxically calming. Morning began not with explosions or the fear of collapsing buildings, but with the sound of footsteps and voices calling them to rise. The barracks would stir, women stretching on their bunks, pulling themselves up into the cold morning air. Light filtered through the windows, and though it was not the light of freedom, it was steady, dependable, unbroken by smoke or fire. They gathered themselves, washed if they could, straightened their bunks, and prepared for roll call. It was strict, yes, but it was also predictable. There was a comfort in knowing what to expect, when to expect it, and how the day would unfold. Clean water, which had become a luxury back home, was available here. The women washed their hands and faces at basins, the coolness of the water shocking against their skin, reminding them of the normality they thought they had lost forever. To wash themselves without fear of running out, to feel the simple sensation of soap against their skin, was an act of restoration. Clothes could be maintained, mended when torn, and washed instead of being worn into rags. These were small acts, almost invisible in the larger story of war, but for the women they were monumental. They gave back a sense of control, of cleanliness, of dignity that the chaos of Europe had stripped away. Breakfast followed. It was simple, bread, porridge, sometimes eggs or potatoes, but it was reliable. They ate in the mess hall, the clatter of utensils and low murmur of voices filling the air. Food was served not haphazardly, not as scraps thrown at them, but in orderly lines, with care enough to ensure that each woman received her share. This predictability itself was healing. At home in Germany, every day had been a question mark. Would there be food? Would there be shelter? Would the night bring survival? In the camp, for the first time in years, they knew the answer before the question was asked. After meals, the women returned to their barracks or were assigned to tasks. Some did laundry, scrubbing clothes at facilities designed for that purpose. Others tended to cleaning, helping keep the camp orderly. For many, there were opportunities to write letters, their hands trembling as they held pens, unsure of what to say, unsure if their words would ever reach the ones they loved. The act of writing itself became powerful, lines on paper carrying their thoughts beyond the fences, connecting them, however faintly, to a world outside. The hours stretched, but they did not stretch endlessly. There was routine, there were tasks, there was time to rest. In the afternoons, some women read if they could, others sewed or repaired what little they had. These simple activities, so ordinary in peace, became lifelines in captivity. They kept the mind focused, the body occupied, and the soul from collapsing under the weight of despair. Medical care was another revelation. In the war-torn streets of Germany, doctors were scarce, hospitals destroyed, medicine almost impossible to find. Illness had become a quiet enemy, claiming lives not with bombs, but with fevers and infections untreated. In the camps, though supplies were not limitless, there was access to doctors, to treatment, to medicine. Women who had been sick for months found relief. Those who had given up on healing felt strength return. To receive care from the very enemy they had been taught to hate was bewildering, but it was also life-saving. Evenings in the camp were quiet, structured as the mornings had been. After the final meal of the day, the women returned to their barracks. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows over the camp, and for a brief moment there was calm. They talked softly among themselves, sharing stories, recalling the lives they had once lived, or sitting in silence, letting exhaustion overtake them. Night came with no sirens, no bombings, no frantic rush to basements. It came gently, and with it, sleep that was not haunted by the constant terror of destruction. The routine repeated itself, day after day, week after week. And though it was captivity, though it was confinement behind fences and guards, it was also survival, stability, and a strange kind of sanctuary. For many women, it was the first time in years they could count on tomorrow looking like today. That stability was a balm to their fractured spirits. The camp was no paradise. It was still prison. It was still war. But compared to the chaos they had known, it was an island of order in a sea of destruction. Many later reflected that they felt safer behind those fences than they had in their own homes in Germany. For while freedom was gone, so too was the constant terror of air raids, starvation, and collapse. The daily rhythm of captivity gave them something the war had stolen, a sense of continuity, of time passing without fear. As the weeks turned into months, the women grew accustomed to the structure. They knew the sound of the morning bell, the pattern of the meals, the faces of the guards who walked the fences. It became in its own strange way a life defined not by chaos, but by order. And though they remained prisoners, though they longed for home, they carried within them the quiet realization that in this captivity, they had found a stability their homeland could no longer offer. Yet ended in silence, broken only by the sound of the wind through the camp fences. Yet the silence itself spoke volumes. They all felt the paradox deeply. They were prisoners, but they were safer here than at home. As time went on, the women began to view the Americans less as faceless enemies and more as human beings. It was not friendship, not affection, but a grudging recognition of shared humanity. The guards, for their part, remained professional, but even their restraint was telling. There were no jeers, no unnecessary cruelty, no deliberate humiliation. In this strange environment, the German women began to see that war was not always black and white, that enemies could still choose humanity over hatred. This realization left a mark on them. Many would carry it for the rest of their lives, telling their children and grandchildren that captivity had changed their understanding of the world. They spoke of how the Americans had treated them not as monsters, but as people, flawed, defeated, but still people. They remembered how, in the darkest years of war, their captors had given them something unexpected, the chance to survive with dignity intact. Some described the camps as places of paradoxical healing. Physically, they regained strength from steady food and medical care. Emotionally, they slowly regained trust in small human gestures, trust they thought had been destroyed forever by the war. Spiritually, many reflected on their beliefs, questioning what had led them into a conflict so devastating, and how they could emerge from it alive when so many others had not. For them, the camp became not just a prison, but a mirror, forcing them to confront both the brutality of the world they had come from and the surprising humanity of the one they had entered. As the months stretched, the initial shock faded, but the memories stayed sharp. The sight of clean sheets, the taste of warm soup, the calm voice of a guard, these became symbols of survival. They came to understand that their captivity was not defined by chains and cruelty, but by an order and comfort that stood in stark contrast to the chaos of their homeland. Some even admitted that when the day of release finally came, they left the camps with conflicted feelings, eager to go home, yet strangely reluctant to leave the security of the routine they had grown used to. Years later, memoirs and oral histories captured their voices. The women did not speak of triumph or glory. But years later, when they spoke of their time in American camps, many did not describe it first as imprisonment, but as a place where routine became salvation. They remembered washing clothes in clean water, writing letters by dim light, eating meals that came like clockwork. They remembered that for a time their lives were more secure as prisoners than as free women in a collapsing Reich. It was a paradox they never forgot, and one they carried with them for the rest of their lives. Over time, disbelief gave way to quiet acceptance and acceptance to reflection. The German women who had first stepped into the American camps in fear and suspicion slowly began to see their captivity in an entirely new light. At first, they had whispered in corners, wide-eyed with astonishment at the food, the beds, the dignity afforded to them. They thought it would vanish any day, that the kindness was temporary, that the Americans would reveal a darker truth. But the days became weeks, and the weeks became months, and the consistency of their treatment began to wear down the edges of disbelief. What had once felt like an illusion became a strange reality, captivity that offered more comfort than their war-ravaged homeland could provide. Some of the women described it later as a gradual awakening. In the first days, they felt like hunted animals suddenly caught in a trap, tense, waiting for the blow. Yet nothing came. Instead, they were fed, clothed, and sheltered. By the second week, they began to eat without fear that the food would be poisoned or snatched away. By the third week, they adjusted to the rhythm of the camp, no longer looking over their shoulders at every step. By the first month, many realized that they were, in a way they had not expected, safe. The relief of safety was profound, though few admitted it aloud at the time. Reflection crept in during the quiet hours, while sitting on a bunk at dusk, while washing clothes with other women, while writing letters that might never reach their loved ones. They began to ask themselves questions they had never dared voice before. Why were their captors treating them with more care than their own government had shown its people in the final months of the war? Why were Americans, the enemy they had been told to fear and despise, providing them with food, order, and dignity? For some, these questions were unsettling. For others, they became seeds of doubt that cracked open the hardened shell of wartime propaganda. Conversations among the women turned reflective. Some admitted quietly that they were relieved to be here rather than in Germany, where bombs continued to fall and hunger stalked every household. Others confessed guilt, that while their children or parents suffered in ruins, they themselves had full stomachs and a clean bed. These confessions are of a strange chapter in their lives, where captivity gave them more than defeat took away. They spoke of how the camps offered comfort, how they learned to see their captors differently, and how those experiences shaped the way they thought about the war long after it had ended. To their families, the stories often sounded unbelievable. How could captivity feel like safety? How could defeat feel like survival? Yet for the women who lived it, those contradictions were their truth. The memory of that paradox became one of the most enduring legacies of their experience. For them, the American camps were not just places of imprisonment. They were places where humanity endured in the midst of destruction, where compassion was extended even to enemies, and where survival carried with it lessons that outlived the war itself. They had entered the camps broken by fear, and though they remained captives, they left with a quiet strength born of reflection, resilience, and the unexpected kindness of their captors. And so, when the German female POWs looked back on their time in the American camps, they did not speak only of fences or guards, but of the strange comforts that defined their captivity, comforts that gave them a chance to survive and memories that would never fade.